Hello, everyone. What I would like to do today is to read you from the new preface for a recent book of mine. The book itself came out in English in August 2023. The title is Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis. So it came out just before the events of October 7th, 2023. The book is now coming out in a Japanese translation, and the publisher asked me to write a preface updating that book, which I think would be interesting to you as well. Preface tries to update the book in terms of what has happened since October 7th. So, as I said, the original English language edition was published 2 months before October 7th, 2023, the Hamas attack on Israel, which had profound repercussions on the conflict as well as on the region of the Middle East as a whole. Now, it should be recalled, however, that relations between Israeli Jews and Palestinians had been deteriorating for several years prior to the current crisis. Things came to a head, especially following the formation of Benjamin Netanyahu's government in late 2022 in coalition with the most extreme right-wing elements in Israeli politics. One result of the almost complete neglect by the Israeli police of the spiraling criminal violence and gang warfare within the Palestinian sector in Israel proper, which vastly enhanced the sense of insecurity in Arab communities. So this was one consequence of that new government. Another was the growing settler and army violence against Palestinian communities in the occupied West Bank. Obviously, both of these became much worse after October 7th. The new government's attempted so-called judicial overhaul was also brought tensions within Jewish Israeli society to new heights. Massive weekly demonstrations demanded that Israeli democracy be preserved from what was seen as a takeover of the judiciary by the executive. As several colleagues and myself pointed out in an open letter we issued on August 4th, 2023, which we called the elephant in the room, this attempt to weaken the Israeli Supreme Court was largely geared to facilitate the intensification of repressive occupation policies in the West Bank, with the ultimate goal of ethnically cleansing and annexing it. Yet most of the protesters were concerned only with the threat to their own rights as secular, liberal, Jewish Israeli citizens and refused to raise the question of the occupation. Indeed, despite the widening gap in Israel between this sector and the growing right-wing and religious majority, pre-October 7th Israeli society was in general agreement that, as Netanyahu had argued for many years, the Palestinian issue could be managed at no great economic, military, or political cost. Locking the Palestinian population behind the separation barrier and bypass roads made it all the easier for most Jewish Israelis to ignore the brutal realities of the occupation. Now, as we pointed out in our petition, confronting the occupation was central to overcoming the fundamental conundrum of Israeli democracy. In the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, currently under Israeli control, live 7 million Jewish citizens who still enjoy democracy, and 7 million Palestinians who either have no democratic rights or are second-class citizens. Consequently, a regime of apartheid has emerged in the West Bank, where two ethno-national groups live under entirely different legal systems, while under Hamas rule in the Gaza Strip, people have been subjected to an Israeli siege. But while the petition garnered thousands of signatures by distinguished international scholars, it had little effect in Israel itself. Then came the Hamas attack that changed people's understanding of the past and expectations of the future. Many liberal Israeli Jews went through what was referred to as a process of sobering up, meaning disillusionment with any prior hopes for peace and reconciliation, having, so to speak, realized that the Palestinians, quote, simply want to kill us all, end of quote. The Israeli right, for its part, saw the Hamas attack as a final confirmation of the need to annex and settle the entire land from the Jordan to the sea, and to remove from it all or much of the Palestinian population. Palestinians initially welcomed the Hamas attack with a fair amount of pride at the humiliation of the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, by several thousand lightly armed militants. Considering the deep sense of powerlessness and utter vulnerability to IDF and settler violence in the West Bank, and the long years of watching prosperous Jewish communities across the fence as the Israeli siege of Gaza condemned them to ever greater poverty and despair, this response by occupied Palestinians was hardly surprising. Palestinian citizens of Israel, aware of the rage and urge for revenge of their Jewish neighbors, expressed much greater fear for their own safety. At sites of regular Jewish-Palestinian interaction, such as universities, expressions of empathy for the civilian population in Gaza could bring quick retaliation, including expulsion by heads of institutions that had previously prided themselves on being bastions of free speech and integration. By now, the tragedy unfolding in Gaza is almost incomprehensible. Nothing on that scale has happened since the Nakba, the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948. And the case of the Gaza Nakba may end up being worse. Close to 2 million Gazans have been displaced, and most of the homes and infrastructure have been demolished. As of early June 2024, over 36,000 people have been killed, most of them civilians, with thousands more buried under the rubble, and over 80,000 have been wounded. A profound humanitarian crisis is unfolding in the shrinking area where the uprooted population, mostly descendants of the refugees of 1948, are sheltering. This human catastrophe is driving a titanic paradigm shift whose outcome is unpredictable. As I've written elsewhere, the roots of this crisis date back to the beginning of Zionism and the growth of a Palestinian national movement in response to Jewish settlement of Palestine. The most important moment in that history is the war and Nakba of 1948, perceived by Israeli Jews as a moment of national resurrection in the wake of the Holocaust, and by most Palestinians as a national catastrophe following the victory of an aggressive, well-organized, and well-supported national and settler colonial Zionist movement. These polar perceptions of the past are also crucial to sketching out any path out of the current crisis. To be sure, at the moment, we are witnessing an almost total inability, even by most liberal Jewish Israelis, to show any empathy for the tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian victims in Gaza, while the violence being inflicted on Palestinians may well breed another generation of fighters eager to take revenge on Israel. Nonetheless, precisely because of the dimensions of the destruction, and despite the desire of some protagonists to go back to normal, it is unlikely that things will ever be as they were before. It must be clear to all that the Palestinian issue can no longer be managed, but must be confronted and resolved. This is not to say that a peaceful resolution is at hand. It is certainly possible that things will go from bad to worse, that an increasingly authoritarian and violent Israeli regime will bank on further militarizing the Jewish population and seek to use this opportunity to so-called solve the Palestinian issue with fire and sword. This will spell the end of democracy in Israel and bring untold suffering on the Palestinians. Increasingly isolated, impoverished, intolerant, and violent against both occupied Palestinians and its own citizens, Israel will also lose the support of many Jews around the world and the backing of its closest allies. In the long run, it will likely become unable to withstand its inner contradictions, but by then, the tremendous pain and agony will have been inflicted on both Jews and Palestinians. The paradigm shift we are seeing, however, may also lead in the opposite direction, not least because of a mutual recognition that barring an ever-metastasizing cycle of violence in a struggle that neither side can win, another path must be found. Precisely because events in the Middle East are showing ever more signs of spinning out of control, international pressure on local actors to seek a political alternative can be expected to grow. But unlike the American, Israeli, and Saudi attempts before October 7th to forge a strategic and economic alliance that would have swept the Palestinian issue under the rug, now it has become crystal clear that such a regional alignment or realignment must include the Palestinians. There are indeed many major Arab and European states eager to participate in such a transformation of relations in the Middle East, one that would also isolate an assertive Iran, marginalize Hamas, and lead to the emergence of a more realistic and conciliatory Israeli leadership. For the past few decades, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been largely driven by religious fanatics on both sides. Such zealots thrive in times of crisis, insecurity, and despair, and diminish in times of greater physical security, material comfort, and hope. Both Islam and Judaism have a long history of moderation, not only extremism, to draw on, which can be called upon in reforming education and advancing interfaith reconciliation. But such changes depend on a transformation in the politics and economics of the region, and on abandoning the extremists on both sides, who are currently feeding each other's frenzy in the name of utopian schemes nourished by rivers of blood. This transformation would be predicated on the ability of Israeli Jews and Palestinians alike to acknowledge and confront the vast carnage and destruction wrought on their societies by their failed leaders, and to sober up once again, this time from their addiction to violence. This will not be the first case in history where nations seized by a fanatical will for dominance and vengeance had to face up to the mountains of debris they and their enemies had piled up, when they were compelled to accept the limits of their power and learned to recognize the blessings of peace, when they reluctantly had to acknowledge that the taste of peace was sweeter than that of victory, that strength was better manifested in renunciation and reconciliation than in subjugation and oppression, and that hope for the future of their children was more deeply felt and lasting than martyrdom in the name of one God or another. It is possible, if we try, to imagine such a turn of events as well. This is a goal worth pursuing. So thank you, and let's hope and pray for peace.